Mrs. Mack by Patricia Polacco. To Bernice McFadden, the woman who taught me about horses and people, with love. Dog Patch. It was the summer of my 10th year. I was spending it with my dad in Michigan, just as I had since I was 4. My brother Richie, my dad, and I were sitting on the talk porch gnawing on sweet corn and watching fireflies shimmer up from the newly mowed grass. Dad grew unusually quiet, thoughtful, then leaned back against the porch step, loosened his belt, and sighed. "Yes, sir. I think this is going to be the summer, Patricia." I waited for the longest time for the next word, searching his face for a clue. "This is the summer that you are going to learn to ride." My heart leapt in my chest because Dad knew my special dream of having a horse of my very own. Learning to ride this summer meant only one thing: that he was going to get me a horse. "When, Dad?" I managed to squeal, and I turned cartwheels for the pure joy and excitement of it. He fell forward. "Tomorrow. How's that, my little filly? Tomorrow." The next morning, as Richie packed for summer camp, I put on the new riding clothes that Mama had gotten for me in San Francisco, just in case. After all, this was the day that I was going to get my own horse. After we dropped Richie off for the bus to camp, Dad headed down the highway toward Lansing, a college town, my mother always called it, because a university was there. "Where are we going, Dad?" I asked, barely able to contain my excitement. Maybe the stable would be somewhere near the college. "You'll see," he sang out as he drove along. I tried to imagine just what the horse would look like. I wondered if it would be anything like the one that I always dreamed of. Maybe I'd never have to go to those dumb old pony ride places where the pony was led around in a circle by a huge metal wheel like a tired merry-go-round. That wasn't real riding. When we got to Lansing, Dad drove by the college, past the city center and Potter's Park. When he finally started to slow, I looked out the window. The houses were run down. Some of them were even shacks. I realized that we were in Dog Patch, the roughest part of town. Dad had made a terrible mistake. There couldn't be any horses here. Then we stopped, in front of the most shabby stable that I had ever seen. A horse trailer right next to a shack had a sign on it that said, "Office." A couple of real tough-looking kids leaned against a hitching rail beside 2 tired-looking horses. I could feel the tears well up in my eyes. Dad wasn't going to get me a horse at all. I didn't want to get out of the car, but Dad took my hand, so I did. The woman with snakeskin boots. We stood there for a while. My eyes took everything in. What an awful place, I thought. It was dirty and unfriendly, and there was a real mean-looking old man leaning over the fence next door. He spat on the ground and mumbled something. "You kids seen Mrs. Mack?" my father finally asked one of the tough kids. Just as they were about to answer, an old 1952 Impala rattled up in front and sputtered to a stop. I had never seen so much dust on a car in my life. The only clear spots on the windshield were where the wipers had made a pass across it. I leaned over and looked inside. I saw a woman with high cheekbones and a broad smile with one overlapping front tooth, just like mine. She had glistening blue eyes and tasseled brown hair that fell to her shoulders. I felt her eyes drink me in. We breathed together for a moment. "Hey, sugar, you must be Pat." She had such a deep southern accent that she made it sound like Pat, not Pat. "Patricia," my dad announced. "This is Mrs. Mack. She's forgotten more about horses than most people will ever know in a lifetime," he said with genuine admiration. The woman, she had on snakeskin boots, got out of the car and walked me over to the 2 kids. "Pat, meet Donnie and Nancy," she'd said. Their eyes looked me up and down. "Show Pat around," Mrs. Mack said as she pushed me toward them. "That's one fancy outfit. Where you from anyway, Hollywood?" the boy said as we walked to the back stalls. I could feel my face flush. He nudged the girl. They both laughed. I didn't belong here. Why had my dad brought me here? I didn't like these kids at all, and they sure didn't like me. And there was that old man. He was watching us again. He didn't look any friendlier than he did before. We walked from stall to stall. Nancy and Donnie told me the names of the horses: Salty, Buster, Lady, Pal, but I could hardly remember anything they were saying because I felt so out of place. Then Nancy jumped up on the fence rail. I climbed up too. "That one there is Apache," she said, pointing to a horse out in the corral. A strawberry Appaloosa, Mrs. Mack's horse. Almost nobody rides him besides her. Only one other horse in this here stable that is as good as Apache, Donnie said, pointing to the back holding pen. "No one rides her, though," Nancy said. I squinted into the pen. There, standing in the broken sunlight, was the most beautiful animal I had ever seen in my life. "This here one is Penny," Nancy said, none too friendly about it. "Ain't she grand?" Donnie said as he'd forgotten I was there. But he was right. My eyes followed her contours. She was perfect. A beautiful buckskin mare with black socks. Her closely cropped mane rode up her arched neck to a full top crop. Her tail was short, but she held it as if it had been set up for a fancy horse show. She stood there almost motionless. As the sun danced through the leaves of the overhanging tree, her coat shone like a bright copper penny. The horse took a step. Her muscles danced through her legs. She looked right at me with her beautiful, intelligent eyes, her ears cupped forward as she made a whiffling sound that rippled through her nostrils. This is the one, I thought. She was everything that was beautiful about a horse. She was my dream. Suddenly, it didn't matter that I was in Dogpatch or that these kids didn't like me. Nothing mattered to me anymore except having the chance to be there with Penny. For the rest of that first day, I just stood and watched the bustle that went on around me. Donnie and Nancy ignored me. They took renters on trail rides. Whenever they returned, they went into the office to have coffee. I felt useless. I started to feel lonely, especially when Mrs. Mack left to pick up the new brittles. I found myself going back to where Penny was and standing and looking at her and dreaming of a time that I might be good enough to ride her. When Dad came to pick me up after work, I didn't say much, but the next morning I was up bright and early, ready to go. I wore my jeans and a t-shirt this time, no ribbons or rhinestones. "Hey, Hollywood," I heard Donnie call out as we arrived. "You look like one of us today." He smiled and I smiled back, but Nancy bolted over between us. She'll never be one of us. Too soft. Then she handed me a pitchfork. "Here, clean out the manure in number 3, 6, and 8 stalls. When you're through with those, curry down Pal and Butch. Someone put them away last night without cooling them down and brushing them." Where is Mrs. Mack, I wondered. I shoveled, pitchforked, curried, swept, and cleaned. Sweat dripped down my chin, but I finished my chores before Nancy and cleaned some more stalls. "Not bad for a city girl," she sneered. Just then I felt a strong hand in the middle of my back. It was Mrs. Mack. "Nice job," she said. Then she looked at me. "Okay, sugar, let's get you started on a horse today." "Am I going to ride?" I stammered, feeling a little afraid. "You sure are," she answered. "By myself?" I sputtered. "All by yourself." Meet Pal. Pal is the gentlest horse I have. I wouldn't put you on anything you weren't ready for, sugar. Mrs. Mack assured me the next day as I stepped in her hand and threw my leg over Pal's back. The saddle seemed hard and unbelievably small. The ground looked miles below me. Keep your heels down. Sit back into the saddle. Ease the rein gently in the direction you want to go. Mrs. Mack kept talking to me. Finally, she led Pal across the road to the large corral. Every step Pal took seemed to rattle my bones. The next thing I knew, Mrs. Mack opened the gate and let go of Pal's bridle. And I was alone. Donnie and Nancy came in too. For the first time in my life, I was riding a horse alone. I wasn't attached to a turning wheel. Keep your hands soft, Pat, Mrs. Mack called out from the fence. And don't hang on to the saddle horn, Hollywood, Donnie said, and grinned at Nancy. She trotted around me. They rode so well, I could feel my tears again. Just then, I heard Mrs. Mack's voice. You look like you were born on the back of a horse, sugar. I could feel the sun shining on my face, and I could almost feel my heartbeat keeping time with Pal's plodding steps. One day I would leave that corral and be good enough to ride out on a trail. I would. Every day for a whole week, I rode good old Pal in the corral. By the end of that first week, I had learned how to put a bridle on him, saddle him, and even know how to back him up. But then, one day, as I was riding Pal across the street, he lurched sideways. I lost my balance and fell off. I struggled to hang on to the reins, so Pal just dragged me along. It's okay, Hollywood, Donnie was saying to me as he took the reins from my clenched fist when Pal finally stopped. His voice was soft and soothing. This has happened to all of us. Even Nancy helped me off the ground. One thing you gotta do is get back on that horse and ride him around the corral one more time, even if you can taste the fear, she said. They both were smiling at me for the first time. I swallowed the fear, got back on, and rode Pal around the corral 3 more times. Mrs. Mack was standing with Donnie